Hey guys, tonight we step through the massive travertine arches of the Colosseum at dawn, when the dew-slick columns gleam like pale ivory under a waking sky, and the distant chatter of guards echoes between the empty tiers. A thin veil of mist clings to the arena floor, swirling around your ankles, and you can taste the dusty tang of ancient sweat and straw. You probably won't survive this journey into the past stand. I say that with a soft grin, because let's face it, the ancients didn't exactly hand out participation trophies. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your current location and local time in the comments below so I know where you're tuning in from, whether it's a cozy living room or some midnight snack mission in your kitchen. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on that cool sand, toes pressing into the pale grains that once felt slick with the blood of vanquished foes. A thin ribbon of morning light snakes through a gap in the western wall, warming your spine and forcing you to squint against its glare. Breezes sift over the empty tiers, carrying the faint echo of distant trumpets and the ghost of chanting crowds. Every stone around you holds centuries of stories etched in wear and tear, and you can almost feel the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes sizing you up. It's early enough that the air tastes crisp, but not early enough to keep the reality of what you're about to face from sinking in. Above you, the Colosseum's arches loom like ancient sentinels, their travertine stones pitted with time. Completed in AD 80 under Emperor Titus, the Flavian amphitheater could host some 50 spectators, an engineering marvel of its era. Marble seats rise in concentric rings, interrupted only by staircases carved into the stone. The outer facade once gleamed white, but centuries of soot and siege have left it a honeyed patina. Traders would hawk olives, wine, and oddities like ostrich eggs from painted carts. And wealthy Romans sometimes arrived in chariots instead of sandals. You shiver as you touch the cool marble, thinking that every polished step cost a life once. Despite its grandeur, you sense the Colosseum's darker purpose. Ground-level openings yawn like hungry maws, giving access to the subterranean hypogeum where beasts roared and condemned souls waited. Historians still argue whether the original design included a fully operational retractable awning velarium that shaded the crowd or functioned only intermittently. Either way, you're exposed now, unshielded beneath the blank sky. A shard of sunlight finds the small of your back, and you wince, wishing for even a scrap of canvas overhead. No sunscreen, no modern SPF to save you, just pure, unfiltered Rome. The arena floor is layered in sand imported from North Africa, chosen to absorb moisture and conceal blood. Fringe authors sometimes claim that wealthy patrons would toss in exotic spices to mask the stench, while others insist that the emperor himself smelled of rose oil. You brush a handful of sand between your fingers and imagine the combatants' feet slipping in the same grains. Nearby, graffiti scratched into the walls by former spectators boasts of slain lions and vanquished gladiators' cocky reminders that bragging rights weren't just for Twitter in AD 80. The air tastes faintly metallic, and you swallow hard. A light breeze teases the dust in your nostrils, like the world's worst confetti, and you can't help a soft snort. This isn't a daytime music festival, and you're definitely underdressed. Sweat beads on your forehead despite the chill of dawn. You check your imaginary watch. No digital display here. Sorry, but you know the sky will clear in minutes, unleashing the scorching Italian sun. Scholars still debate whether early morning events were scheduled to avoid heat stroke or primarily for spectacle. Either way, sunscreen would have been goose grease or crocodile dung, not SPF 50. So bring your own aloe vera in spirit. You hear the first crack of wood on wood as two combatants practice behind the scenes, their blades singing in the hush before the storm. Somewhere below, you swear you catch the faint roar of a caged lion ground staff warming up the main attraction. The Colosseum's clever design allowed trapdoors to send beasts and fighters crashing through the floor, and the floors were sometimes flooded for mock naval battles. Fringe reports even speak of staged sea creatures imported for show, though most scholars dismiss it. Still, imagine a crocodile snapping near your foot this early, definitely bumpier than your last subway ride. Your breath fogs in the cool air as you edge toward the center, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the quiet stadium. Nearby, a fresco shows gladiators raising shields in salute to the Emperoran act of loyalty that could win a pardon or seal your doom. Historians still argue whether a single thumbs down meant mercy or execution, since the Latin pollis verso might be upside down for us. You pull back your shoulders, keenly aware that choices here were as brutal as any sword. In this early light, you feel strangely honored and foolish all at once. Squares of sunlight now slice across the sand, and echoes of distant Campanian hills drift on the wind. You inhale deep, tasting pine resin and stale wine that memory insists lingered on the breath of excited fans. A stray beam glints off your imagined breastplate, reminding you that you're ill-equipped, no helmet, no armor, just your wits and whatever privilege you hoped would spare you. But privilege doesn't translate well in a place built for spectacle. As the shadows shift, you sense the first patter of dozens of feet on stone stairs, the slow rise of an audience ready to feast on human drama, and you can't help but think this was the world's first reality TV. No rewind button, no edits, just raw life and death. Your pulse quickens as footsteps tumble downward, and you realize this arena will soon fill with purpose. There's no halftime show, no concessions stand just fate. You steady your breath, bracing for the roar that will drown out every modern fear. Welcome to Dawn's reality, where history becomes your gauntlet. You slip behind a low wooden barrier into the gladiatorial pens of the morning, where the air shimmers with heat rising off earthen walls and the sharp scent of sweat mingles with olive oil. The pens belong to the ludus, the training schools overseen by a lanista, that rigorous instructor who turns novices into champions or corpses. You watch as seasoned fighters strain under the ministrations of their assistants, every muscle gleaming with oil that catches the dawn light like polished bronze. Historians still argue whether these oiling rituals were purely functionalto, keep skin supple and protect against sword cuts or performance spectacles designed to thrill early arrivers. Fringe rumor has it that a few hopefuls smeared crocodile dung as primitive sunscreen, though most scholars dismiss that as salon gossip. You inhale deeply, tasting the tang of salty brine from the nearby sea breeze, and wonder if your modern SPF would have fared any better. Spoiler, you'd still fry. Nearby, a line of gladiators crouch on benches carved into dusty stone, their assistants brushing blood-slick sandals free of dried gore. You rub salty sweat from your browno towels here, just the rough fabric of a tunic pressed against gritty sand. An old trainee offers you a small wooden comb, letting you run its teeth through frizzed hair, an oddly human moment before the brutality. You can't help smirking at the thought, who needs a spa day when you can face a lion instead? One fellow scratches a phallic charm against his belt, claiming it's a fatum ward to keep fortune on his side. Mainstream lore holds that many gladiators tattooed magic symbols on their armstony shields against death's edge yet. Historians still argue whether these were common or the eccentricity of showmen. Your gaze drifts to a veteran smoothing oil into his shoulders. He flexes, skin rippling like waves, and you feel that frisson of envy mixed with dread. There's a rhythm to their movements massage. Stretch. Flex each a calculated step in a deadly dance. You flex a finger experimentally and imagine gripping the hilt of a gladius, the short sword favored by Roman heavy infantry and gladiators alike. The gladius typically measured about 60 centimeters and weighed roughly a kilogram, stout enough for quick, brutal thrusts. Some fringe accounts claim certain swords were secretly coated in plant poison, so even a graze could be fatal, though most scholars still argue whether such tactics were widespread or sensational exaggerations. You run an imaginary fingernail along the edge, marveling at how these fighters trust such slender steel with their lives. A clang of metal on stone echoes as a lanky youth hunches over a sharpening stone. Sparks dance like fireflies against the dim morning. You inch closer, hands itching to grip the worn wooden handle of that whetstone. The blacksmith's apprentice guides the blade across the stone at a precise angle 17 degrees, they say, though historians still argue whether that was standardized or varied by school. Each stroke strips away dullness, leaving a gleaming edge hungry for flesh. You can practically hear the blade whispering, "Come on, it's just one jab." A stray spark lands on your sandal, sizzling softly, and you jump back, instant reminder that you're a guest here, not a gladiator. A modern aside drifts across your mind. Sharpening your motivation with a to-do list may save you from a performance review, but it won't save you here. As your heart thumps, you notice the hopeful bravado etched on every face. Gladiators flex arms built like ramparts, chest plates gleaming under slivers of sunshine. You see the nervous tremor beneath a young fighter's grin and recall that this hopeful arrogance is a thin veneer over primal fear. A fringe notion suggests some professional gladiators formed deep bonds with their opponents, sharing oiling rituals as a twisted form of camaraderie, though most academics still argue whether those anecdotes reflect camaraderie or survival tactics. You feel your own pulse surge in echo of theirs, realizing that beneath the iron resolve, they quiver like startled horses. A horn sounds brassy, commanding, and you join the line of fighters funneling toward the railing. You glance back at the dawn-lit arches, remembering the cool mist that clung around your ankles just moments ago. Now the arena sun inches higher, promising blistering heat. A trainer murmurs encouragement words you barely hear over the roar of your own breath. You swallow thickly, tasting grit and oil, and remind yourself, you volunteered for this. Well, virtually volunteered. You press your palms to the cool stone rail, lean forward, and lock eyes on the arena floor where the crowd will soon gather. You catch a glimpse of carved graffiti, Marcus versus the Beast, and Lucilla's 5th victory. Fan culture in AD 80 was apparently a real thing. Signed posters, chants, the works. Historians still argue whether emperors encouraged these cult followings to stoke public fervor or to distract restless masses. You adjust your imaginary helmet, which, spoiler, you don't actually have, and flex your fingers around an invisible sword hilt. Your muscles tremble, not from weakness but anticipation. The morning rituals, the oiling, the combing, the sharpening were meant to transform fearful bodies into icons of strength. But you know it's a fragile illusion. A stray bead of sweat trickles down your spine, and you wonder if that little spark of dread will save you or betray you. You lean in, ready to step into the spotlight, but the morning's sacred preparation feels more like a fragile promise than a shield. Your lungs fill with dust and resolve, and as you stand shoulder to shoulder with these warriors, you realize that after all these rituals, hope might be your deadliest weapon. You step through a low-arched entrance carved into the north wall, heart tapping against your ribs like a frantic drum, and descend a narrow stone ramp into the hypogeum. The air here is cool, dank, and carries a faint metallic tang like stepping into a giant, subterranean pantry of fear. Your sandals scrape against the worn blocks, each step echoing in the vast underbelly of the Colosseum. Above you, the arena floor is nothing but a thin wooden stage. Below lies a labyrinth of cells, trapdoors, and rusted pulleys that once hoisted snarling beasts into the sunlit spectacle. Historians still argue whether the original amphitheater featured a fully realized hypogeum from AD 80, or if Domitian's renovations in the 90s expanded the underground maze. Either way, you're about to witness its full glory minus the overlapping screams of onlookers. Of course, torchlight flickers against damp walls, revealing splatters of mud, straw, and something darker. You swallow hard, you're not sure you want to know when that something was fresh. Spiders scuttle from archways, their long, bristly legs clicking softly, as if applauding your brave, your foolish descent. A cold droplet falls from the ceiling onto your shoulder, and you shiver, remembering the dawn's warmth. You tighten your tunic around your chest, wishing for even a scrap of that crocodile dung sunscreen rumor to shield you from this gloom. Instead, you're left in modern fibers that taste like irony. Narrow corridors branch off into shadowed cells. You pause before one, peeking in. Wooden bars stained dark, straw scattered across a grime-slick floor. Somewhere in this warren, lions, bears, and leopards waited, roaring into the darkness. You can almost feel their hot breath seeping through the wood. Imagine razor teeth snapping in anticipation. Fringe sources claim some prisoners left ritual inscriptions on these bars, tiny prayers scratched with desperation rather than defiant strange runic letters that scholars still argue are authentic or clever forgeries. You trace your finger along a jagged groove, thinking of the gladiator's chants above, then realize that in these tunnels, only the beasts whispered. A sudden grumble vibrates through the stones in echo of gears turning. You follow the sound to an enormous wooden platform groaning under the weight of some unseen load. This is the elevator, one of dozens that could raise cages into view in seconds. Romans engineered these lifts with complex pulleys powered by teams of workers in the basement. It's a marvel of ancient engineering, one mainstream fact that still leaves you slack-jawed. You imagine the tension on the ropes, the yells of the pulley operators, and the sick thrill when a roar thundered out onto the floor above. You brush your hand against the rough-hewn beam and wonder how many fingers were crushed in practice runs. One of your own fingers twitches uneasily. A narrow passage leads you to a small antechamber, where a damp alcove holds broken shields and mangled helmets discarded after violent debuts. You kneel to examine one corroded piece. The bronze mouthpiece is jagged and warped, and you can practically hear the clang of metal on metal. You toss a pebble across the cavernous space, and it skitters like a frightened rat. Rumor has it that some misguided staff used rescued prisoners as guinea pigs to test improvised weapons, hair-poisoned darts, sharpened brass tridents. Historians still argue whether such experimental brutality was sanctioned by the Emperor or confined to rogue Lanistae. You swallow, picturing yourself as a test subject in this backroom lab. A faint hissing sound draws your attention to a slitted corridor, where steam coils through tiny vents. This was part of the hydraulic system that could flood the arena for mock naval battles marine reenactments called naumachii. The idea that the Colosseum could transform into a temporary lake still feels like myth, even though it's a well-documented feat of Roman engineering. You step closer and feel moisture bead on your skin, as if the hypogeum still retains phantom tides. You step back, mindful that real water might rise unexpectedly if ancient channels were reactivated. A light trickle falls at your feet, and you realize it's not water at all, but sweat dripping from the ceilings low, persistent, unrelenting. Your torch sputters as you move deeper into the maze. Shadows dance across the rough-hewn walls, and you catch a glimpse of faded graffitinum scratched by long-ago victors, hopeful prayers, or bitter curses. One crudely carved inscription reads, "I, Valerius, was robbed by Felix," hinting at faction rivalries even among fighters. Fringe historians suggest some of these marks were elaborate pranks by bored mechanics, but most scholars still argue whether any of the graffiti predate the building's abandonment. You lean in, voice hushed, and counter with a joke. "Great! Even in AD 80 people complained about being outplayed." A sudden rumble vibrates beneath your feet, the distant hooves of an unseen horse. No, just the world above, shifting as midday crowds jostle in. You glance upward through a grated trapdoor and glimpse blinding light. It's a reminder that above this subterranean netherworld, tens of thousands of spectators roar for blood. You exhale, tasting dust and adrenaline, and lean on an iron ring set into the wall, used for tethering cages or chaining down scaffolding. Your fingers grip cold metal, and your chest tightens. This corridor smells of sweat, fear, and the lingering scent of vinegar once used to clean blood off stone. You continue forward until a narrow spiral staircase ascends toward a grated exit. The air grows warmer, more charged with expectation. As you climb, you spot a smudge of red on a stubborn stain that refuses to fade. You press your palm to the metal grate overhead and feel the heat of the sun returning. The roar of the crowd intensifies, and tiny flecks of sand drift down through the bars, landing on your upturned face. You blink away the glare, heart pounding, and recall the smooth arches of dawn, now replaced by the blinding midday glare. You shrug, muttering to yourself, "Crocodile dung would have been a better investment than SPF." At the top, you pause beneath the grate, curiosity warring with dread. The hypogeum has shown you its secrets, the hidden lairs of beasts, the creaking lifts, the clandestine corridors that stoked the Empire's bloodlust. You draw a deep breath of stale air, then step through onto the sun-drenched sand, eyes adjusting to the brightness. You realize the underground world was the Colosseum's beating heart without it. The show above would be nothing more than a dusty ring. As you climb back into the blinding light, you carry the memory of darkness with Euthalo growls, the hiss of water, the weight of stone walls pressing close. Above, the Emperor's box awaits. The sands lie red, and a new wave of challenges beckons. You straighten your shoulders, ready to face whatever emerges through the trapdoors next. The moment the horn blasts, the arena trembles beneath your feet, as if the earth itself is cheering. You barely have time to register the metallic clang before a wave of sound hits roar upon roar, like an ocean of voices crashing against stone cliffs. The crowd of some 50 zero souls, unleashed to witness bloodsport inaugurated by Emperor Titus in AD 80 over 100 days of games, erupts into frenzied applause. You feel it in your chest, a rattling thump that syncs with your own racing heartbeat. It's like being inside a giant speaker, but instead of bass drops, you get the thump of war drums and the guttural cries of the masses. You probably wish you'd brought earplugs. Instead, you grin wryly and remind yourself that modern stadiums with foam fingers have nothing on this. A swirl of dust rises around you, tickling your nostrils with the scent of sweat, stale wine, and spilled olive oil. Somewhere nearby, a vendor hawks skewered ostrich legs, yes, real ostrich toe thrill seekers with exotic protein. Fringe accounts even claim some enterprising fans dunked those legs in a honey glaze to sweeten the spectacle, though most scholars still argue whether any Roman street food matched that level of Instagrammable absurdity. You wrinkle your nose at the thought and pat your empty stomach, wishing for a simple modern granola bar. At least you can say you skipped the wheat-free trend in AD 80. Up in the stands, you glimpse painted ticket-small wooden tesserae inscribed with seating assignments. Anyone who's ever tried scoring a front-row concert ticket knows how precious those are. Back then, these were literal tokens, handed out by patrons who sponsored games to curry favor with the emperor. Historians still argue whether those tesserae were legitimately booked weeks in advance or distributed last minute to ensure maximum panic. Either way, you're grateful you're not the one scrambling for a seat when the show starts. Your gaze flicks to the north gate as two gladiators emerge. They stride onto the sand with disciplined swagger, crested helmets gleaming, scuda raised to catch the sunlight. You catch a flash of bronze and hear metal scrape against metal, and your nerves spike in anticipation. This is no choreographed dance. This is raw, life and death. A stray glance at your imaginary forearm shows goosebumps bristling beneath your tunic. You swallow hard, tasting grit and adrenaline. In your living room, you'd probably reach for a bag of popcorn. Here, you're tasting fear-flavored dust. The combatants circle each other, axes raised. Their shadows flicker on the sand, shifting like living ghosts. You notice one fighter tap his shield 3 times in a quiet rhythm before meeting his opponent's Gazea ritual meant to intimidate. This silent code, passed down through the ludus, marks respect and signals readiness. Fringe narratives suggest some gladiators employed secret hand signals to coordinate surprise attacks, though most academics still argue whether such conspiracies ever truly existed or are just fans' wishful thinking. You smirk. Who needs binoculars when you have insider info? Modern sports might have replay reviews, but here you're on live, unedited camera. Suddenly, the lion's roar cascades from the east gate, intertwining with human shouts. The crowd's cheers surge again, and you lurch sideways as if hit. You steady yourself on the nearest pillar, marveling at how the amphitheater's design amplifies every sound no microphones needed. Historians still argue whether architects intentionally sculpted the tiers to funnel noise inwards, or if it was simply serendipity. Regardless, you're caught in a sensory tsunami that makes a rock concert feel like a library whisper. A pair of javelins sails through the air, thudding into the sand with satisfying thumps. You flinch, imagining one grazing your shoulder. Modern safety regulations would file a lawsuit within minutes. Here, you'd probably get a one-way ticket to the Hypogeum if you complained. You laugh, imagining the RNLI, Roman National Legal Institute, stepping in. "Excuse me, sir. Could you not spear me in the face?" The absurdity warms you even as the sand kicks up around your ankles. The fighters clash at the center, blades scraping, shields cracking. You lean in, breathing shallow, focusing on every metallic ring. You can practically feel the sparks fly, though real sparks would kill you faster than a serrated gladius. A glint on the edge of a blade catches the sun, and you squint, blinking sweat from your eyes. You consider winking at your opponent's social cues might confuse them momentarily, but you remind yourself that winking is probably frowned upon in Mortal Kombat. Above, a distant chant swells into a unified scream. You look up at the tiers and spot a woman in bright purple stola waving a cloth, signaling for mercy or doom. The Emperor watches from his box, draped in imperial purple, thumb poised. Remember the debate over thumb signals? Historians still argue whether a thumbs up spared or sentenced to death. You shrug. Better hope she's voting for mercy. Your breath catches when the lead gladiator spins, sending a shower of sand flying like a golden rain. It settles on your shoulders, mingling with old sweat. You brush it away, only to feel more grit fall. Modern hotel vacuuming could solve this in a flash. Here, you're on your own. You inhale, tasting faint hints of crushed Timuse to treat wound sand. Remind yourself that no amount of wound ointment commentary in a YouTube tutorial would help you here. This is bleed and repeat, with no skip button. One gladiator falters, and the crowd's roar tilts to a savage crescendo. You feel a chill despite the sweltering heat. A stray shout cuts through. "Ave! Hail the victor!" You realize that calling out names in this crowd is like chanting for your favorite influencer, except the stakes are higher than losing Wi-Fi. Fringe rumor claims some emperors sent personal notes to winning gladiators, but scholars debate whether those were genuine or staged PR ploys. You smile. Even in ancient Rome, they knew how to do influencer marketing. As bodies clash, you notice the distant reflection of sunlight on a discarded helmet. It glints briefly before tumbling into the sand. You watch as a page hurries to retrieve Ithily monogram. The faster you run, the more dust you kick up. You inhale another lungful of sandalwood-scented oak resin, an aromatic bandage meant to calm nerves. Modern essential oils have nothing on this. The crowd's uproar dips and surges like waves on the Tiber. You breathe with it, matching your pulse to the throbbing bass of voices. You realize you're no longer just an observer, you're part of the spectacle. Your mind races with survival strategies worthy of a centurion's manual. Dodge left, duck right, maybe start singing to distract them. You chuckle at your own ridiculousness. Suddenly, a trumpet blast signals the first casualty metal rings against stone, groans muffled by the cheering masses. You blink, momentarily stunned, then swallow, steeling yourself for what comes next. In your cozy bedroom, you'd probably pause here and reach for a pillow. Instead, you lean forward. The first roar of the crowd has claimed its power. And you're just trying to last until the next bell. The sun has climbed to its zenith, turning the arena into a blazing kiln where every grain of imported North African sand glows like hot embers. Remember that dawn's cool mist clinging to your ankles? Now it's replaced by a suffocating heat that presses against your skin like a smothering blanket. The Colosseum's retractable awning, known as the Valerium, could shade up to 2/3 of the seats with its massive canvas sails. But at noon, most spectators in the upper tiers bake in direct sunlight. Historians still argue whether the Valerium was operated by skilled sailors stationed atop the amphitheater or by specialized roof crews. But either way, today, whichever shade exists feels woefully inadequate. Fringe sources claim that wealthy patrons once imported Apennine snow to sprinkle onto hot benches and create mini cooling station ice packs before ice machines. But most scholars dismiss this as imaginative gossip. You raise an arm to shield your eyes, the coarse fabric of your tunic already clinging to sweat-soaked skin. Every exposed patch of flesh radiates heat, and you can feel your hair stick to your forehead. A hawker nearby pushes a wooden cart laden with goat's milk and honey, ingredients rumored to be smeared over fighters' bodies to reflect sunlight. Although historians still argue whether such slick treatments actually cooled gladiators or simply made them look glossy for the crowd. You picture yourself slathered in goo glittering like some ancient YouTube influencer, then shiver at the thought of sticky sweat. Modern SPF would never survive this environment. Even SPF 2 feels like a sunburn waiting to happen. Your throat feels like a parched amphora, craving a single drop of water. In your living room, you'd breeze through a 10-minute rainstorm in a coffee shop just to Instagram an iced latte. But here the only refreshments are jars of pasca, mix of water and vinegar favored by lower classes and fighters alike. Romans often carried pasca in flasks between bouts, but historians still argue whether gladiators drank it for hydration or merely as a spectacle to showcase stoicism. Fringe tales whisper that some fans would sling sponges on sticks soaked in wine vinegar at fighters, giving them a quick, sticky rinse between swings. You think about texting your friend to bring you a Gatorade and then mentally slap yourself. You know Gatorade didn't exist until 1965. Beneath your boots, the sand has shifted from pale ivory to sunburnt gold, sizzling with each step. Gladiators often fought barefoot, trusting calloused soles over cumbersome caligae. But you cringe at each grain, stabbing like a miniature needle. You hobble, imagining protective henna paste or crushed mint leaves applied to the schiena, quirky rumor suggesting gladiators carried small pouches of crushed plants to soothe burns. Historians still argue whether these botanical remedies were common field treatments or the eccentricities of fringe healers. You bend to pick up a handful of sandits so hot you nearly jolt your fingers away. If only you had a space-age gel pack from your first aid kit to slap on. Your stomach growls, the midday hunger pangs coming for you instead of sparing a second to worry about lunchtime burritos. Wealthy Romans might have munched on stuffed dormice or crunchy olives between events, but dormice were considered a delicacy reserved for the elite. Historians still argue whether dormice vendors actually roamed the amphitheater or if this is just a fanciful embellishment in foodie manuscripts. Fringe accounts even allege that a few daring fans roasted dormice on portable spits, selling them as gladiator snacks. But most scholars cringe at the thought. You fantasize about ordering pizza delivery to the Colosseum. Good luck sneaking a pizza through the gates. Heat haze shimmers above the arena, bending the distant tiers like a wavy mirage. Your vision blurs at the edges, making every figure seem to float, half out of reality. A modern aside drifts through your mind. You'd probably call an Uber for a fan-on-demand service right about now. The oppressive sun saps your willpower, leaving you wobbly and uncertain whether the next moment you'll keel over or collapse into giggles. Scholars still argue whether midday games were shorter to protect participants or deliberately dragged out to display Rome's collective endurance. Whatever the reason, you feel time stretching like molten taffy. Droplets of sweat trace rivers down your neck and spine, and you dab your forehead with the corner of your tunic only to find that fabric soggy and useless. The midday bell tolls, signaling the end of one match, but you're no closer to relief. Vendors hawk fresh garlands of olive leaves, a gesture of victory and supposed cooling. Yet olive wreaths do little against the sun's cruel glare. Fringe storytellers claim emperors sometimes commissioned bronze fans polished like mirrors to reflect heat away from themselves. But historians still argue whether those fans were practical tools or pompous props for pageantry. You sigh, picturing the emperor lounging with a reflective shield while you roast. As the midday crowd's uproar dips and surges like waves on the Tiber, you stagger to lean against the nearest column, feeling the travertine radiate heat like a broadsmith's forge. You close your eyes, trying to conjure that dawn's gentle breeze. But instead, you smell a heady mix of sweat, spiced wine, and scorched leather. Jokes aside, you know this relentless sun will break you long before a sword does. Modern heat advisories would have you indoors with your AC blasting and an ice-cold smoothie in hand, but here, the only chill comes from the memory of hypogeum shadows. You exhale, tasting salt and dust, realizing that midday in the Colosseum is a crucible designed to strip away every comfort. You wipe a smear of sweat from your upper lip and wonder how many fighters collapsed here. Not from a blade or claw, but from sheer, unrelenting sun. The Valerium sails overhead flutter sometimes, but you doubt they're worth the cost. You grip the column's rough surface, heart hammering, and steel yourself for the next wave of spectacle. The arena's furnace might scorch your spirit, but the games have only just begun. You step through the massive east gate as a guttural roar rolls over you like thunderand. Then you find yourself face to face with a rugged lion, its tawny mane bristling like wildfire in the sun. The beast's amber eyes lock onto yours, pupils narrowing, and you taste the iron of your own rising panic. A whisper of dust drifts between you, carrying the musk of earth and fur. Every instinct screams to flee, but your legs are frozen in the sand, each grain crunching under your boots like tiny bones. Historians note that Romans imported African and Syrian lions by the thousands for these games, sometimes capturing up to 100 animals in a single expedition, an astonishing logistical feat that underscores the empire's reach and cruelty. Scholars still argue whether these encounters were carefully choreographed spectacles or raw, unscripted battles that pitted man against truly wild fury. The lion shifts its weight, claws scraping the sand with a metallic hiss. You swallow hard, mouth suddenly dry, and you realize your spit would roast faster than your skin. A tremor runs down your spine as you recall fringe reports of trainers feeding their lions honey-marinated antelope to sharpen their predatory instincts on odd delicacy, meant to dazzle the crowd with extra feisty performances. Whether that actually happened is up for debate, but it sure makes you wish you'd never learned the word marinate. Modern zookeepers would never dream of sticky treats for safety reasons. Yet here you're the exhibit. A sharp whistle cuts through the roar of the audience, and a lanky bestiarius specialist beast fighter steps onto the sand, carrying only a trident and a net. You recognize him from the hypogeum, muscles taut and skin gleaming with oil. He raises the net in one hand, prongs rattling, as if to say, "I'm the game warden. Don't bother running." You press your back against the cold stone of the podium, remembering the earlier hype. The crowd paid a delicate fortune to see a man wrestle a lion with nothing but mesh and javelin. Fringe observers claim some of these nets were coated in fish oil to confuse the beast's scent, but most scholars dismiss that as wandering hearsay. You shrug. Fish oil or not, I'd rather swim with sharks. The lion charges with a low growl, vibrations rippling through the air. Your heart hammers in your throat, each beat echoing like war drums. You stumble backward, knees threatening to buckle, and you taste the grit of sand mixed with old sweat. A roar from the stands shakes you some graffitied note, must have said, "Best fight ever." And you cringe, imagining their cheers as tiny pins piercing your nerves. You glance at the gladiator's trident. It gleams ominously under the midday sun and wonder if a three-pronged spear is enough. In modern terms, this is like giving you a barbecue fork to fend off a charging rhino. As the beast barrels closer, you catch a stray whiff of spiced wine in the breeze vendors, mixing Posca with a dash of Falernian to boost popularity, rumor says. Historians still argue whether spectators truly sipped fermented wine between roars, or whether that's just poetic license in aging manuscripts. Either way, you'd kill for even a drop of cool water. The sand whips around your ankles as the bestiarius raises his net, shouting a crack command in Latin you barely understand. You can practically feel the vibrations of the lion's roar in your bones, and you wonder if you're actually standing on sand or directly on top of a drum. The net swings wide, snapping like a whip against the lion's flank. The animal shudders, fur bristling, then lunges, claws outstretched. You flinch as the sand erupts around its paws, grains shooting upward like sparks. The bestiarius jabs with his trident, aiming for the shoulder, a tactic meant to slow the beast's momentum. Fringe accounts suggest some bestiari carried hidden sharpened blades in their sandals for last-ditch defense, though scholars still argue whether that was widespread or just mythical bravado. You shift your weight, picturing a concealed dagger snapping into your hand only to realize you've got nothing but sweaty palms. Your breath comes in ragged gasps as the lion rears on its hind legs, towering over its rubber-necking audience. All at once, the roar dims, replaced by the hiss of sand and the rapid rustle of feet scrambling for higher ground. You glance upward. 50, zero eyes tracking this primal dance. A stray pebble clinks against the wall, maybe thrown in excitement, or perhaps to test the lion's reflexes. You'd crack under this kind of scrutiny at your last job interview. Here, you're the main event. The bestiarius steps back, breath steady, net poised. The lion paws at the mesh, snarling, saliva dripping like liquid glass. You blink and taste metal on your tongue, adrenaline rush, or a spray of spittle. The creature roars again, a deep, guttural sound that reverberates through your chest. You press your palm to your sternum, almost expecting the drumbeat sensation to guide you like a metronome. Instead, your heartbeat skips, and you wonder how many men have collided with those claws and walked away. A spray of sand erupts as the beast lunges again. The net catches its foreleg, momentarily binding it. Its guttural roar morphs into an enraged screech, and you catch a spray of fur against your cheek so close you feel each hair like bristles. You stagger back, blinking from the sting, and your imaginary helmet clangs against the column behind you. There's a sideways dance of man and beast, circling, striking, parrying, but a true dance requires partners, and this lion isn't collaborating. You grit your teeth, remembering the blood-soaked sand from earlier matches, This is more than a spectacle. It's theater, writ in sweat and dread. Fringe historians claim emperors sometimes sent audience plants into the stand sectors who would call for mercy at just the right moment to sway the crowd. Whether that happened or not, you'd pay someone to wave a white flag on your behalf right now. A soft whoosh of breeze carries the faint melody of panpipes from a distant corner musicians marking the rhythm of blood sport. You consider humming along to calm your nerves. Then you remember that humming might irritate the lion. The beast thrashes, claws tearing the net, and the bestiarius raises his spear for a final thrust. You inhale a lungful of heated air, tasting every grain of dust like a rusty coin. A collective gasp ripples through the crowd, half fear, half exhilaration. The spear lunges, the net snaps free, and the lion recoils, pelt flashing in the glare. There's a heartbeat of stillness. Then the beast bounds away, vanishing back through the gate into the hypogeum. Silence crashes over the arena before the crowd's roar picks up again, louder than before cheers for victory, relief, or simple bloodlust. You exhale, blinking at the sandy floor, knees weak. As you brush grains from your boots, you can almost taste the lingering danger like the aftertaste of strong espresso. You realize this was no mere pageant. It was raw nature versus human will. Historians still argue whether lions were starved slightly beforehand to heighten the drama, or whether that's just sensational exaggeration. Either way, your next strategy session would involve never facing a cat larger than a house kitty. Modern liability insurance would never cover this kind of stunt. You step back to the barrier, shoulders trembling, and flex your fingers, craving something solid shield, a spear, maybe a giant red cape to confuse the beast. But you have nothing except the echo of claws and the thump of your racing heart. You release a shaky breath and lean your forehead against the cool stone, tasting the dust and sweat mingling on your skin. A stray beam of sunlight slants through the hypogeum grate, illuminating floating particles like fireflies. You close your eyes and whisper, "Crocodile dung sunscreen, take me now." Half in jest, half in desperation. As the roar of victory fades into chatter about the next fight, you realize you're alive for now. The lion is gone, but its presence lingers in the trembling of the air. You step away, mind buzzing with adrenaline and half-baked regrets. You glance at the midday clock, if such a thing existed here, and realize you've just survived perhaps the most feral of encounters. Next up, a fleeting dream of shade, water, and escaping this ancient reality. But first, you need to find your pulse. You stagger off the sand and lean against a weathered column, breathing hard. When you notice that blood trickling down your forearm is a lot darker than you'd hoped, not to mention a lot more permanent than that SPF you forgot to pack. Welcome to the scarcity of aid in the Colosseum, where medical care is as rare as a breathable breeze at midday. Gladiators were considered valuable investments by their owners Slanisteso, a team of Medici, physicians, often stood by behind the scenes with rudimentary tools. But don't expect an ER with fluorescent lights or a panicked nurse shouting, "Stat." Instead, you'll get a handful of squishy poultices and a whispered wish. Historians still argue whether these gladiatorial Medici were part of the imperial staff or contracted privately by wealthy sponsors. But either way, their version of healthcare would send your modern HMO into cardiac arrest. A Lanista's assistant kneels beside you, pulling a goatskin bag from his belt. He rummages through it as sweat pools on your brow. Inside are strips of linen, a small flask of wine, and a crusty jar of honey. You remember that fringe tidbit about honey's antiseptic properties. It's not just a sweet topping for your hypothetical breakfast toast. Romans swore by it to seal wounds. Some claim they even spread spider webs over cuts, believing the silk's natural stickiness and antiseptic residue would keep infections at bay. Whether those cobweb dressings were mainstream battlefield medicine or the flights of fancy of an overzealous healer, scholars still argue whether such treatments saved more lives than they doomed to tetanus. The assistant pours a trickle of wine over the gash on your arm. The acrid smell of fermented grapes mingles with the scent of sweat and dust. You wince as the liquid stings, thinking modern-day painkillers would have you laughing through a paper cut, let alone a blade nick. He then scoops honey from the jar and presses it gently into the wound, forming a sticky seal. You try not to gag at the gooey texture. This is less first aid and more ancient artisanal face mask. A soft snort escapes you, because if your last spa day involved cucumber slices, this is definitely a downgrade. Nearby, a figure in a white cloak Galen's followers would call him a medicus rummages, through a leather satchel filled with small bronze instruments, scalpels, forceps, and tiny probes. Romans valued bronze for its durability, though historians still argue whether they understood its antimicrobial properties or simply used what was at hand. You peek at the tools and imagine modern stainless steel kits with sterilized packaging and glowing LED handles. No contest. The medicus selects a scorched iron rod to cauterize deeper cuts, heating it red hot over a brazier. You blink at the flickering flames, your local fire marshal would lose their mind. Fringe accounts whisper that some gladiators used crocodile dung mixtures as rudimentary antiseptics, believing the alkali in ancient dung repelled infection. But you recall that crocodile dung sunscreen joke and decide you'd rather face a lion again than test that on yourself. As the rod sears your wound, you taste burnt hair and copper on the back of your tongue. A sharp hiss fills the air, and you clamp your teeth together, trying to suppress a groan. You feel the heat radiating through the fabric of your tunic, and you close your eyes, picturing your living room couch with its plush cushions and remote control. Here, you're on an operating table made of uneven sand and hope. The medicus murmurs instructions in rapid-fire Latin, perhaps telling his assistant to fetch more wine while his cloak flaps in the subterranean draft. Historians still argue whether gladiators received priority treatment over condemned criminals, or if all wounded souls were heaped together in the same grim cubicle. With the wounds sealed, the medicus wraps your arm in a linen bandage soaked in vinegar. Vinegar, a staple in Roman households, doubled as disinfectant and flavoring, a 2-for-1 deal you don't see in modern medicine aisles. You marvel at how they repurposed kitchen staples as surgical tools. A stray drop of vinegar hits your nose, and you wrinkle it at the sour. Tang reminds you of the time you accidentally spilled cleaning spray on your lunch in college. This, of course, ended much better than you ended up today. The assistant helps you to your feet, and you stagger back toward the arena's edge, bandaged arm swinging as if it belongs to someone else entirely. You rub the back of your unaffected hand against the column's cool surface, letting the smooth travertine soothe your shock. A tiny bead of sweat trickles into your eye, and you blink it away. There's no saline solution or eye wash here, just gritty tears and a wish for aloe vera. You shake your head, muttering, "Next time, I'm bringing my Medicare card," half laughing at the absurdity. Your thoughts drift to the arena's center, where the next spectacle is already underway. A mock naval skirmish. They're flooding the floor in sections, sloshing water in like a sloppy water park. You recall the hypogeum's hydraulic channels and imagine your wounded arm flopping around in that brine. Modern OSHA regulations would ban that in a heartbeat. You shiver at the thought salt water in an open, cauterized wound. That's like dunking a paper cut into the ocean and expecting it to be beach day. A roar from the stands reminds you that you're in the no-turning-back zone. You step forward, bracing against a sudden wave crashing just beyond the wooden partition. The water laps at the planks, dripping onto your leather sandals. Historians still argue whether these mock naumachii were grand naval reenactments or small-scale skirmishes meant more for show than genuine sea fight simulation. Either way, you're about to be dunked in more than old H2O. You grit your teeth as you edge onto the plank, bandaged arm raised to maintain balance. Water sloshes around your calves, chilling you to the bone despite the blistering sun overhead. The sand gives way beneath you, and you stumble, nearly plunging into the murky pool. You steady yourself, feeling the weight of the soaked bandage sagging, a reminder that this half-hearted medical aid may not hold up if you get cut again. A modern aside flickers through your mind. You download an app for a virtual doctor consult in a second. But here, you have a local medicus with questionable technique and a jar of honey. As you step into the frigid water, you feel a shock run through your body. The vinegar-stung wound shrieks with every wave, and you grit your teeth, forcing yourself not to yelp. You imagine a 21st century nurse shaking her head, clipboard in hand. You should have come to us. But hindsight is as useless as a broken trident in this moment. The water swirls around you, and you catch a glimpse of a lonely oar drifting by, likely a prop from the stage ships. It bobs like a wooden ghost, echoing the fate that awaits those who falter. You push forward, pressing your bandaged arm against your side to protect it as you navigate sloshing water. Below the surface, you sense shards of wood splintering leftover fragments from earlier matches or stage sets. Each step feels like wading through a maze of hidden traps. Fringe storytellers claim that some Laniste deliberately hid jagged debris to incapacitate their fighters, though scholars still argue whether that was a standard tactic or an evil outlier's scheme. Either way, this is not the beach vacation you signed up for. Finally, you emerge from the water onto a dry patch of sandy floor, chest heaving, arm throbbing. The next wave of cheers hits you as you rise, dripping and disoriented. You pat your bandaged arm self-consciously. If modern bandages came in neon colors, you'd choose bright pink to signal, yes, I was nearly eaten by a lion and dunked in a swamp. Instead, you're a walking testament to ancient improvisation. Goat, skin satchels, scorched irons, honey poultices. You take one more shaky breath, taste stale sweat mixed with muddy water, and wonder if the next round will offer anything resembling competent care. As you look toward the north gate, you realize that in the Colosseum, the greatest healer is time, and even that isn't guaranteed. You lean against the cool travertine railing of the Emperor's podium reserved for Imperial eyes only and feel both honored and nauseated by proximity. Above you, the Emperor sits on an ivory throne draped in purple silk, that inimitable hue of power derived from thousands of tiny murex snails harvested along the Mediterranean coast. A mainstream fact. Roman emperors often presided over games themselves, flaunting their authority by granting mercy or death at a simple gesture. As you peer up, you feel his gaze like a spotlight, and you realize this is less reality TV and more Survivor, ancient Rome, minus immunity idols and product placements. A hush descends on the crowd as two gladiators lock shields in the arena below. You watch their blades meet in a shower of sparks so bright they remind you of a DIY welding project gone awry. The spectators hold their collective breath. You do too, though you'd trade a year's worth of YouTube comments for a modern stadium's quiet please announcement. The arena seems to hold its breath in unison, waiting for the Emperor's verdict. Will you live or die? You can almost hear a faint click in your brain. Thumbs up. This is the spectacle of power in its purest form. Fringe whispers claim that early emperors sometimes used hidden hand signal switches of the nose or blink codesto convey their wishes, preserving deniability if the crowd's reaction grew unruly. Most scholars still argue whether such subterfuge really happened or if it's just the kind of conspiracy theory that sold well in imperial gossip columns. You smirk. Imagine live streaming your blink patterns on Twitch. Talk about subscriber goals. The Emperor raises his right hand, pausing. Your heart thumps in rhythm with the shifting sand below. You remember the debate over that famous Latin phrase, Police verso. Historians still argue whether a thumbs up meant mercy or doom, since literary sources muddle which direction signaled death. Some suggest a turned thumb down into the fist symbolized a thrust of a sword, while a thumb wrapped inside indicated sheathing. You chew on that as you watch the crowd mimic the motion, half-starved for clarity. It's like trying to interpret lip reading on a scratched phone video. In the calm before the decision, you catch the scent of perfumed oil mingling with sweat and dust. The Emperor's attendants spray a fine mist of rosewater and extravagance you'd kill for now, given your lingering sunburn from Section 5's blast furnace. Imagine a modern stadium spraying water mists to cool fans. Here, it's more for show than relief. Fringe accounts even claim they added honey to the mist for sweet fragrance, an ancient air freshener, though scholars still argue whether that concoction attracted more flies than fans. Your gaze flickers between the combatants. One fighter staggers, chest heaving, blood oozing between segmented plates of his scutum. The other stands poised. Gladius raised his arm, a taut bowstring ready to release. You swallow, tasting grit and adrenaline in equal measure. The crowd surges like a living wave, clamoring for carnage or compassion. You find yourself torn. Part of you hopes for mercy, while another part thrills at the raw power of pitiless judgment. It's a savage peek into humanity's collective cycle, like watching comment threads explode over a hot-button issue, except here people's lives hang in the balance. As the Emperor's arm arcs through the air, you feel centuries of etiquette tighten your chest. You inhale the dry, sulfur-tinged air. A single bead of sweat traces the line of your jaw, reminiscent of the time you nervously awaited exam results, except that those stakes involve nothing more than a letter grade. Fringe rumor suggests some emperors timed their gestures to the beat of a drummer hidden on the podium ancient background music, so the crowd's reaction was choreographed like a flash mob. Scholars still argue whether any percussionists were actually tucked behind the throne, or if that's just a theatrical flourish in later retellings. The Emperor's thumb hovers midway, silencing the crowd as thoroughly as a power cut at a rock concert. Above you, the folds of his toga ripple in a slight breeze, as though even his garments brace for impact. And then down. His thumb presses decisively toward the sand. The first gladiator staggers, Gladius drooping, and the crowd erupts. Cheers and jeers, crashing in a cacophony. You exhale, realizing the victor will spare his life for another day, a tiny mercy in a world built on blood and sand. You taste both relief and guilt. Emotions so tangled they feel like knotted leather. In that heartbeat, you recognize the Emperor's crux. Absolute control over both life and death. This was more than entertainment. It was governance by spectacle, an assertion that power transcends all. A modern aside flutters through your mind. You'd message your boss, "Hey, remember that time you let me skip a report? Thanks. Here, you're at the mercy of a single gesture." Fringe commentary claims emperors sometimes feigned indecision waving a fan or sipping wine before dropping the dreaded digit, turning the show into a cliffhanger. Scholars still argue whether these theatrics were genuine or retrofitted by historians longing for scandal. You glance at the victorious gladiator, chest heaving, tears of triumph streaming through a mask of grime. He raises his sword in salute, and the crowd roars anew. The vanquished fighter stumbles toward the edge, sword shaking in numb fingers, and bows before the Emperor. A medicus stands ready, although you know his potions and poultices will work wonders only if the blade missed a vital organ. You watch as the lanista extracts a small token from his pouch, perhaps a medallion marking his service. It clinks in the sunlight like a fallen coin. You think, "I'd settle for a Band-Aid and a smoothie right now." The Emperor leans forward, signaling the end of the ceremony. The sand swallows the spilled wine from celebratory libations, leaving only streaks of crimson that catch the afternoon light. You lean out over the railing, tasting lavender oil from the victor's braided Hera post-fight coiffure meant to comfort and intimidate. Ironic, you muse, that grooming mohawks now is considered edgy, but back then, it was just part of the job. Fringe stylists even claim some fighters used kohl eyeliner to appear more fierce, though historians still argue whether that was retroactive cosplay or authentic ritual. As the podium empties, you feel the final notes of imperial spectacle fade, replaced by the murmurs of a new crowd settling in. The sand still vibrates underfoot, humming with anticipation for the next act. You rub your forearm bandage intact, despite the earlier encounter, and marvel at how a simple thumb could sway the tide of life itself. You release a quiet laugh, half scared, half awed. No swipe left or right, just one thumb. You step away from the Emperor's box, body buzzing, mind churning with the weight of that gesture. Pictures of modern influencers flashing hashtags flicker briefly, mercy or murder, but those are fleeting, while a Roman's thumb bore eternal consequences. You shake your head, as though dislodging lingering dust and doubt, and strut toward the arena edge. The next spectacle beckons. The slow whirl of tides in the naval reenactment, or the thunder of hoofbeats in the chariot courses. Wherever the sand leads, you know you're in for another round of calculated dread and fleeting mercy. Your mouth is a desert, and you can almost hear your tongue crackling against the roof of your mouth as you trudge toward the center of the arena. The sun burns overhead, and every breath feels like sucking through a straw coated in sand. Water, the elixir of life, seems as distant as the Tiber River itself, flowing somewhere beyond these towering walls, but never here where you need it most. Gladiators once fought for hours without a single drop of H2O, the Gatorade-infused miracle drinks you guzzle during workouts, but stark, austere sustenance. Mainstream accounts tell us that Romans engineered elaborate aqueducts to channel fresh water across the empire. Yet none of it landed directly in the Colosseum's arena. Instead, water stood at the mercy of supply carts and jerry-rigged fountains in the vomitoria, the corridors through which spectators poured in. Historians still argue whether there was ever a dedicated draw pipe for water inside the amphitheater or if all hydration came exclusively from vendors. Either way, you're parched. You spot a vendor weaving through the crowd, balancing a wicker basket filled with sponges on wooden sticks. These weren't your run-of-the-mill game day giveaways. They're dipped in Posca, a tangy mixture of vinegar and water deemed refreshing by fighters and foot soldiers alike. You snag one, pressing the damp sponge against your lips. It's less like quenching thirst and more like licking a sour sock, but it's something. Fringe rumor insists that some gladiators added crushed mint leaves to their Posca to mask the vinegar's bitine ancient energy drink hackbutt. Most scholars still argue whether these herbal infusions ever reached the brutality of the arena. You wrinkle your nose at the aftertaste, thinking a minty toothpaste strip might have been a sweeter compromise. As you press through the milling crowd, the sun's glare catches on a painted sign above a temporary wooden stand. Proxima Portia Fresh Posca here. The vendor's yells cut through the roar of the spectators, hawking liquid in amphorae so big you'd mistake them for decorative urns if you weren't dying of thirst. You elbow your way forward, imagining this as a modern-day cereal aisle scramble butt instead of discounted boxes. You're fighting for a sip of ambrosial vinegar. You laugh weakly, recalling that one time you sprinted for a free coffee at a conference, only to find it lukewarm. Today's stakes are marginally higher. The vendor thrusts a wooden cup into your trembling hand. It's heavier than you expect, brimming with a murky brown liquid that smells like pickles left out in the sun. You gulp it down in 2 desperate mouthfuls. The vinegar tang stings your throat, and you cough up a fine spray of Posca that lands on a nearby spectator's toga. He wrinkles his nose but pats his chest in agreement. Shared misery is just another form of camaraderie. You grin, wiping your lips, and quip to yourself. Next time, VIP passes better include bottled water. Your throat still burns, but at least you're marginally less dehydrated. You glance down at your wrist matters of fashion aside. You'd kill for a Fitbit to track your hydration levels right now. Instead, you have parched lips and sand-caked ankles. The midday bell tolls, signaling the next round, and you force yourself to drink again, slowly savoring the vinegar's cleansing burn. Modern athletes might scoff at this homebrew electrolyte shot, but you suspect they never dealt with gladiatorial-grade thirst. You stagger back toward the edge of the arena and lean against a sun-warmed pillar, feeling each pore on your skin scream for relief. A breeze teases across the sands, but it's hot enough to fry an egg on a shovel, frankly. You wouldn't be surprised if someone tried. Fringe tales suggest that wealthy sponsors once had slaves carry portable snowballs in waxed crates to sprinkle over the sands and cool the fighters. But most academics still argue whether those snow shipments ever happened or if they're just the ice cream truck fantasies of overindulgent narratives. You can't help but wish for even a snowflake right now. Heat haze shimmers at the far end of the arena, distorting the next combatants into wavering silhouettes. With every passing second, the dryness in your throat tightens like a tourniquet. Sweat beads on your brow and rolls down the side of your face, but it offers no salvation, only the illusion of moisture. You sip again from your nearly empty wooden cup, now warped and splintered from grip. A sudden drip of Posca trickles onto your palm, and you lick it off as though it's the last drop on Earth. You muse that this is one hydration challenge you definitely would not TikTok a tutorial for. You notice a line of wooden tokens at the vendor's feet, some new, some chipped and weathered. Patrons exchange coins for these tokens, which they then trade for Posca or a crust of bread to stave off hunger. None of them taste particularly fresh, but as you gulp another swig, you realize that survival here is barter-based. A sip of vinegar for a sliver of stale olive bread. You chuckle at the barter system's ironies, as if you're at a flea market for your own well-being. You wonder if someone has invented a barter app for ancient Romans yet. Probably not, given that slaves handled the logistics. Your vision blurs at the edges, a shimmering mirage that makes the distant Hypogeum entrance look like an oasis you'll never reach. You recall that emperors occasionally gifted drinking cups embellished with ivory and pearls to distinguished gladiators' tokens of esteem, or perhaps bribes to keep them fighting another day. Historians still argue whether these gifts were genuine honors or cynical political gestures to pacify the masses. You'd settle for a ceramic paper cup in your current state. A low groan from the stands catches your attention. A fellow spectator has fainted, succumbing to the same dehydration that assaults you. You lean over to offer your Posca sponge, but it's spent, and you barely have a drop left. You laugh softly, half in sympathy, half at the absurdity. Sharing is caring unless it's vinegar. You pat him on the shoulder and promise yourself you'll stay upright, no matter how your legs threaten to turn to custard. Someone nearby tosses a small sponge toward you, an offering of solidarity. You catch it awkwardly and press it to your forehead, tasting the last remnants of vinegary moisture. You dab your lips and mutter a sleepy aside. Is it bedtime yet? As the afternoon glare intensifies. 3 light jokes tumble through your mind. About ordering an Amazon Prime drone in AD 80. About bottling amphitheater mist for skincare, and about the awkwardness of Posca breath on a first date. You shake your head, clear it, and remind yourself this isn't a spa retreat. Finally, the afternoon horn sounds, signaling a brief respite before the next bout. You cup your hands around your mouth and shout toward the vendors. "Refill, please!" The call echoes weirdly in the sun-drenched arena, and you grin at the fellow survivors who cheer you on. You realize this collective thirst binds you all flesh, stone, and sweat united in parched solidarity. Gasping for breath, you realize that dehydration here is less a medical condition and more a crucible for the human spirit. You press your palms flat against the travertine column, feeling its cool solidity ground you in something unyielding. You taste the last drop of your Posca-soaked sponge and feel a fleeting moment of triumph. If you can survive this brief lull without face-planting into the sand, maybe, just maybe, you'll last until dusk. But that's still a far cry from lasting 24 hours. You trudge back toward the arena's edge, drenched in sweat and carrying the ghostly echoes of cheers and screams like a second skin. The midday sun lingers stubbornly, but now your mind grapples with something darker than thirst or heat. The unsettling psychological toll of this slaughter for spectacle. Here in the Colosseum, life and death collide in the sun-bleached sand. Yet it's the echoes in your skull, the hollow thuds of shields against flesh, the metallic ring of gladii that weigh heaviest. While you're catching your breath, you sense that you're not alone in your discomfort. Hundreds of fighters have felt it before. The creeping dread that you're less a person and more a marionette in a macabre puppet show. You recall a mainstream fact. Gladiatorial schools, slutty, are not just training grounds, but tightly controlled communities where combatants shared barracks, meals, and grudging respect. These ludus relationships could be as vital to survival as a sturdy gladius. You imagine hugging your sparring partner after a particularly brutal bout, except that in AD 80, hugging usually meant holding someone's disemboweled corpse, so maybe opt for a respectful nod instead. Fringe whispers even speak of gladiators toasting fallen comrades with cups of Posca after matches, a bizarre camaraderie forged in shared trauma. Scholars still argue whether these post-battle rites were widespread bonding rituals or isolated spectacles staged by ambitious Lannister to entertain the crowd and sell more amphorae of vinegar. You press your palm against the sandstone railing, the grainy surface familiar now, and you feel your heartbeat racing in time with distant cheers for the next match. The psychological weight sits in your gut like a stone, thicker than any melanoma you made fun of in Section 5's sunburn jokes. You wonder, how do these men steel themselves to step into such a pit of despair? Some say it's duty, others say it's fear of the lash if they refuse. Historians still argue whether refusal meant a return to civilian life or a death sentence in the hypogeum. You'd skip that particular career choice if the HR department were this lethal. As you shuffle forward, you notice an inscription carved into the arena wall. Amic vis meves Fidlesheim, my dearest friend. It's a jarring discovery too. Gladiators who fought bare-chested one moment, now immortalized as friends in stone the next. Fringe lore suggests that some pairings were intentionally matched by sympathetic Lannister who recognized the odd comfort these fighters found in each other's presence. Whether this was an act of compassion or cold manipulation to heighten the emotional stakes of combat is still up for debate. Scholars still argue whether the inscription was meant to honor genuine friendship or simply to fluff the game's narrative like a scriptwriter tweaking a reality TV storyline. You glance around and spot a pair of arm-mounted shields lodged side by side, an emblem of a skills duel, where both combatants tricked the crowd by feinting at each other, eventually tapping out in mutual respect. The crowd roared at the end, hungry for spectacle, but what you feel is a soft pang of empathy. You imagine a modern athlete consoling a beaten rival after a match, trading jerseys and telling inside jokes. Here, you might end up trading blood instead. Still, the idea that two sworn enemies could share a fleeting moment of solidarity surprises you. You chuckle quietly. Imagine franchise tag in football letting you buddy up with your opponent. Breathing in the dusty air, you recall the fringe notion that some gladiators would write farewell letters to each other before bouts, tucking them in hidden belt-roof scraps of parchment bearing blessings, apologies, and crude doodles of beasts. Historians still argue whether any of these letters survived, or if they're just battlefield myths romantics tell to soften the savage edges. You'd swipe right on that kind of bromance, except your thumbs are too sweaty to work your imaginary scroll properly. You take a shuddering step into a patch of shade created by a crumbling arch, where the angle of the sun dims the sand to a gentler hue. The stillness feels surreal, as if the stone is offering a brief moment of mercy. In this hush, you feel the battered psyche of every gladiator who came before you. The anticipation that churns like sour wine in the belly, the adrenaline that hammers like a smith at his forge, and the guilt that lingers long after the final trumpet. You consider how many fighters retreated from the sand only to collapse in silent tears, the roar of the crowd replaced by the roar of their own regrets. As your pulse steadies, a distant chant rises. Homo Emina! The crowd coaxing murder rather than mercy. You picture thousands of voices united in a single primal decree, like a hive mind fueling the bloodlust. You realize that it's not only the gladiators who bear scars. Every spectator carries a shard of this brutality in memory. How else would people feel alive on a sweltering afternoon, if not for the thrill of witnessing another's fight to the death? It's a psychological cocktail that modern thrill-seekers might chase in extreme sports or horror films on Netflix. Here, there's no pause button when the monster jumps out. You shift your weight, mindful of your bandaged arm from Section 7's Medici ad hoc treatment, and watch as two new fighters meet in the Sandone, a burly Murmillo, the other a nimble Retiarius. Their contrasting styles heighten the tension, but you notice something else. A subtle nod exchanged before the clash. A fleeting gesture, easily missed by the crowd but charged with meaning. Was it an apology? A plea? A promise of a duel fought with honor rather than malice? Scholars still argue whether these nonverbal communications were coded messages among fighters or simple courtesy taught by their Lannistae. To you, it looks like the faintest flicker of humanity, still glowing amid the blood-red sands. Your throat jerks tight as the Murmillo swings a heavy scutum, the clang reverberating like a bell toll for souls. In that moment, you feel a surge of sympathy for both Manon bound by chainmail, the other dancing with a weighted net. You realize that solidarity here isn't about defeating your foe. It's about sharing a load too heavy for any one person to carry alone. A modern aside drifts through your mind. You'd never pay 50 for tickets to see two people cuddle in an MMA cage. But here, that silent handshake would cost you Survivaland. You'd thank your lucky stars for that fleeting human bond. The Retiarius lunges with his trident, tapping the Murmillo's shoulder before spinning aside. The Murmillo pauses not out of mercy, but in calculated pause, granting his opponent a breath. This act of restraint elicits a suspenseful hush, followed by a ripple of applause so quiet it feels intimate. You catch your breath, tasting dust and hope. You imagine the crowd holding its breath at a symphony's final chord, but instead they're here for gladiatorial jazz-improvised notes of violence and brief interludes of compassion. As the retractable awning overhead creaks softly in the breeze, you reflect on how this arena, designed for slaughter, also bore witness to ghostly friendships. You feel the weight of those untold alliances settle in your chest. Heavier than any piece of armor, the moral paradox of cheering for both brutality and humanity twists like a strand of rope. You want to survive, and you want these men to survive for the sake of that fragile camaraderie. You straighten, brushing flecks of sand from your tunic, and step forward. The next clash awaits, and you steel yourself with the knowledge that beneath every roar for blood lies the whisper of a shared glance, a hidden message, a bond born in the shadow of death. Survivor's guilt? Maybe. But in this arena, empathy might just be the trickiest weapon of all. You notice the sun dipping lower, its fierce glare softening into a honeyed glow that snakes across the sand in long, trembling ribbons. After surviving that blistering noon furnace, you cling to the foolish hope that fading daylight brings respite. But the Colosseum isn't done testing your limits. The heat lingers in every stone, and the shifting shadows only reveal new pitfalls. You squint against the amber light, toes curling in the grainy sand, and wonder if twilight here will feel like the cool evening walk you crave, or simply another layer of dread. The tiers above begin to blur into silhouettes as sunlight filters through the travertine arches at a shallow angle. Long shadows stretch from one end of the arena to the other, making the sand look like a giant chessboard only here. The pieces fight for their lives. You remember how, in Section 5, you wished for a sliver of shade under the Valerium. Now, the changing light offers a natural canopy, but not nearly enough to stop the stone from radiating heat. Historians still argue whether the Colosseum ever hosted regular evening games once torches and braziers were lit, or if dusk events were rare novelties reserved for imperial celebrations. Some fringe sources whisper that organizers experimented with phosphorescent moss harvested from remote caves to line the hypogeum corridors, glowing faintly to guide late-night beasts and fighters. Whether that's practical illumination or the fanciful invention of overzealous storytellers is up for debate. You half expect to see tiny green sparks flicker across the passageways below, guiding unseen horrors up the trapdoors. You smirk at the notion. Glow-in-the-dark arena. I'd download that as a horror comedy app in a heartbeat. The crowd's roar mellows into a low rumble as the golden hour deepens. You watch spectators shield their eyes with hands that are likely sunburned to lobster-red perfection. You spot a young woman in a linen tunic, dabbing her cheeks with oil-soaked clothing ad hoc cooling trick you first encountered in Section 8's Imperial Spectacle. Even the Emperor's perfumed rosewater mist would struggle against this lingering furnace. You lean against the cool travertine, feeling its residual warmth tickle your palm, and remind yourself that no modern air conditioner, no matter how loud, could replicate the bizarre thrill of this moment. In the waning light, the arena's subtle features come alive. You see the faint runic graffiti scratched into a column echoes of Section 3's labyrinthine hypogeum inscriptions. Names and curses shimmer in the golden glow, reminding you how past souls left their marks in fading stone. You trace one carved heart with arrowed initials, wryly imagining the ancient equivalent of a hopeful TikTok caption. Rome forever. It's a poignant reminder that even in this pit of violence, humanity persisted in small gestures of sentiment. The next bout is announced by the creak of wooden trapdoors and the patter of feet. Two fighters emerge, silhouettes outlined by the setting sun. One carries a heavy shield rimmed with bronze. The other wields a curved Psyche dagger that glints like moonlight trapped in steel. You brace yourself, thinking a dagger looks about as welcoming as a pop-up ad for a root canal appointment. Still, you lean forward, drawn to the ritual dance that unfolds with each clash of metal and sinew. Shadows pool beneath their feet, stretching toward the audience in inky tendrils. You remember how, in Section 6, the lion's roar seemed to echo through the hypogeum like primal thunder. Now, as dusk settles, you half imagine hearing phantom roarsa lingering aftershock of earlier battles. Historians still argue whether the acoustics were an unintentional marvel or a cunning design to amplify every murmur and sneeze. You wriggle your toes in anticipation, grateful you've already braved raw nature's fury. A faint breeze skims over the arena floor, carrying the scent of spiced wine and sweat. Somewhere, a drummer taps a slow beat on a wooden druma tradition some fringe commentators claim was introduced to simulate an approaching heartbeat of war. Whether that was Emperor-led hype or a later embellishment remains in scholarly dispute. You tap your foot to the rhythm, half aware that you're syncing with the arena's pulse rather than your playlist back home. The dying sunlight glints off a discarded helmet, illuminating dents and dried blood like constellations in a copper sky. You approach it out of curiosity, touching its rim with reverence. You recall Section 7's makeshift medical cave, where Medici wielded heated irons and honey poultices. This helmet might have once protected a man whose arm you now wear in a crude bandage. The bittersweet irony makes you chuckle. If only I'd negotiated a protective gear clause in my contract. Above, the imperceptible shift to evening sparks a collective hush. Traders pack up their remaining Posca sponges and goat's milk jugs, like vendors closing a carnival booth. You watch their wooden carts rattle away, leaving behind only the scent of vinegar clinging to the stone. In Section 9, that same Pascha felt like a mercy. Now, it's a fading memory of hydration that slipped through your fingers like water in a sieve. Two fighters brace in the center, backs to the low sun. The Murmillo's steely gaze locks on the Retiarius, who ducks low behind his trident. Their shadows merge into one dark shape, an abstract sculpture of tension and toil. You hold your breath, tasting the faint metallic tang of impending conflict. A stray spark of light flickers off the warrior's arm guard, momentarily blinding you with its brilliance. You blink, wiping sweat from your eyes, and realize the sun's final act is to blind you before night fully arrives. Suddenly, the clang of metal on metal breaks the stillness, snapping you back. The fighters clash, each blow sending grains of sand skittering in lazy arcs. You hear the sharp ringing echo reminiscent of Section 4's crowd roar cacophony, but now filtered through the lens of dusk. The sound feels distant, like a dream recalled in half-light. 3 light jokes tumble through your mind about ordering an emergency night mode filter for reality, about installing mood lighting in ancient amphitheaters, and about wishing for a modern flashlight app. You let out a quiet laugh, hoping neither fighter notices your amusement. Each strike sparks a tiny flurry of sand, floating upward like embers from a dying bonfire. The fading light backlights the motes, turning them into golden fireflies suspended in a breeze you can almost taste. You swallow, savoring the moment that balances between terror and beauty. It feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for the final curtain of daylight to drop. As the sun's last sliver sinks below the western wall, a hush falls over the Colosseum. Torches at the perimeter sputter to life, tiny flames winking on like distant stars. Mainstream sources note that night games were sometimes lit by oil lamps and braziers, though historians still argue whether these were bright enough for real combat or merely set the mood for a ghost story marathon. You watch as flame light spills across the sand, transforming the arena into a flickering cathedral of shadows. The fighters pause, chest heaving, arms trembling with fatigue. In that pause, you sense the briefest glimmer of hope that maybe this dying light signals the end of the day's cruelty. You lean forward, gripping the railing, tasting the mix of sweat and smoke on your lips. A wisp of wind carries the faint melody of a lyre someone playing a soft requiem for the day's fallen. You close your eyes, letting the music wash over you, and for a heartbeat, you imagine yourself back home, tucked beneath a soft quilt with a bedside lamp. But the world here offers no bedtime story. The torches hiss, the drums murmur, and 2 silhouettes advance toward each other in the flickering glow. You exhale, steeling yourself for another round. The fading light may be gone, but the Colosseum's relentless pulse continues. You might have fooled yourself into believing twilight was salvation. Perhaps you even whispered a quiet, "Finally." But the arena has more tests in store. So you take a deep, steadying breath, flex your bandaged arm, and step back into the flame-lit fray, knowing respite won't come until the final horn calls time. Night settles over the Colosseum like a velvet cloak, and for the first time since dawn you feel the slightest sigh of relief as if the stones themselves exhale. Torches along the arena's perimeter flare to life, hurling flickers of amber across the sand. The sudden glow transforms familiar features into a ghostly panorama. Columns become phantoms, the hypogeum entrances gape like yawning maws, and every carved inscription from Section 3's frantic runes to Section 9's spray of Posca splatter shimmers in the wavering light. You probably thought darkness would be your friend after that blistering sun. But here, absence of daylight deepens every fear you've tried to outrun all afternoon. You step into the ring of torchlight, toes curling against the cool sand that has finally relinquished its midday heat. The smell of burning oil drifts on the airpine resin mixed with resin-coated wixan aroma that brings to mind modern camping trips gone wrong. In AD 80, torches were often fueled by olive oil, a mainstream fact that also explains why the air tastes faintly of salad dressing. You squint around, realizing that while the flames illuminate only a handful of yards ahead, the rest of the arena melts into a starless void. It's as if you've wandered off the grid with no smartphone flashlight app to guide you. A soft breeze rattles the low wall, carrying whispers of distant chants and the faint clatter of armor from the shadows. Somewhere beyond the torch circle, you swear you hear footsteps, not the measured tread of a gladiator, but the scuffle of unseen creatures. Historical accounts tell us that nocturnal animals sometimes slipped into the hypogeum, prowling corridors at night. Rats, geckos, and perhaps even retired boars from earlier beast hunts. Historians still argue whether crews deliberately unleashed small critters to heighten fear before dawn events, or if they simply got lost in the maze and fared better than ill-fated fighters. You can't decide if you'd rather face a rat-sized adversary or a full-grown lion again. At least a lion had a certain dignity. Your eyes adjust to the shadows, revealing the tall silhouette of a bestiarius kneeling at the edge of the torchlight. He's feeding embers into a brazier, coaxing sparks higher. You peer closer. Tiny charms hang from his belt-animal teeth, painted shells, and feathers that fringe wolf pelts. Fringe sources claim some bestiarii wore owl feathers in their helmets to call on nocturnal wisdom, believing that Hecate's spirit would guide their steel when daylight failed. Whether those charms actually whispered courage or simply rattled like low-budget Christmas tinsel is still up for debate. You tap your foot against the grainy sand and mutter, "If owl feathers work, sign me up, though I'd probably trip over them." A distant clang echoes from Section 4's eastern gate as gladiators retreat to private pens. The sudden sound slices through the night's hush, dragging your pulse along with it. You recall how during the day every clang felt like an act of war. Now, in the gloom, it's a reminder that nowhere here is entirely safe. The hypogeum's trapdoors groan on their hinges, and you imagine beasts or fighters slipping through the darkness below, ready for a secret midnight show you never signed up for. Modern theaters have stage crews and dimmers. Here, you have ropes, pulleys, and pure primal unpredictability. A flicker of movement draws your gaze to the top tiers, where spectators huddle beneath the velarium's tattered remnants. Some hold oil lamps, small ceramic bowls floating on slender stands casting ghostly circles of light. You envy their vantage point. From up there, you imagine the arena looks like an ancient amphitheater enchanted by wizards. However, historical texts suggest night games were rare due to religious prohibitions against spilling blood under the gods' dark sky. Scholars still argue whether those restrictions were strictly enforced or merely guidelines conveniently ignored when the emperor fancied a special spectacle. Either way, you wouldn't challenge divine protest signs even if you had a neon open one for backup. A woman's voice drifts from the stanza song in Latin. You don't fully grasp but feel in your bones. A lullaby turned battle hymn. The melody weaves through the torch's glow. strangely soothing and unsettling at once. You lean against a column, letting the song wash over you, tasting salt from sweat and resin from the flame. In Section 11, you felt the weight of camaraderie. Now the music fuses with shadows, reminding you that every spectator here participates as both audience and witness to your unraveling composure. The ground beneath your sandals shifts, slightly settled sand giving way to something firmer. You look down and notice a ring of scorched earth where the oil from earlier matches seeped into the soil, igniting under torchlight's kiss. 1 foot in front of the other, you navigate around the ring, mindful that this arena floor is as treacherous by torchlight as it was under the midday sun. Fringe tales claim some Lannister-embedded hidden caltrops beneath the sand to maim fighters who tried to flee, though most academics dismiss that as a sadistic fantasy. Still, you lift each step as though you're tiptoeing through a modern minefield. Ahead, your breath plumes, in the chilly night air an unfamiliar sensation after hours of heat. The torches flicker, and you catch the silhouette of a recent graffiti carving a crudely etched wolf's head scowling from a column. It reminded you of Section 3's hypogeum runes, now transposed onto the above-ground world. Someone drew that wolf under moonless skies and dared the next fighter to meet its gaze. You laugh softly. Big bad wolf, more like big bad sand rat. A hush falls, broken only by the rasp of torches and the distant drip of water from Section 7's makeshift medical tent. A Medici stomps toward the arena, carrying a small brazier and a leather satchel. In Section 7, his daytime methods involved honey poultices and scorched irons. Tonight, you suspect he's brewing a stronger draft, perhaps an herbal concoction to steady nerves. Fringe healers allegedly used mandrake root under a full moon to lull pain, though scholars still argue whether mandrake's reputation was myth or medicine. You'd take that over vinegar any day. Unexpectedly, the song from the stands crescendos, and a figure steps through the torchlight wearing a glistening helmet tipped with peacock feathers. His entrance feels ritualistic, like a midnight pageant. You recall Section 8's imperial spectacle, but this seems different, more arcane. The crowd parts, lanterns bobbing like willow, the wisps guiding the newcomer. He strides to the center, unarmed, and raises his arms in a silent invocation. The torches flare higher, shadows dancing around him like applauding hands. You swallow, wondering if this is a gladiator calling for a miracle or a charlatan begging for mercy. He begins a silent pantomime, drawing lines in the sand with the stick circles, triangles, odd sigils that echo the ancient world's fascination with magic. Supplants of incense fill the air, frankincense and myrrh, aromas you'd expect in a temple, not a blood pit. Historians still argue whether practiced priests ever sanctified the Colosseum floor before night matches, or if such rites were the invention of later storytellers. Either way, you'd pay someone with a PhD in ancient rituals to tell you whether these sigils spelled protection or just spelled "you're toast." A gust of wind gusts through a breach in the outer wall, snuffing a few torches. Darkness flares back like a hungry beast. You latch onto the nearest pillar, knuckles white, and blink until the flames reignite. You'd hate to be that guy who screamed louder than a derailed roller coaster. A nearby gladiator recognizable from Section 6's lion fight leans over and offers you a water skin wrapped in cooled cloth. "For the night's trial," he says in low Latin. You accept with trembling fingers, tipping it back in one gulp. It's cold, oily with residue, but it tastes like salvation. Refreshed but wary, you drip water over your forehead and across your arms. The coolness shocks your system, an unwelcome reminder of how raw you truly are. You realize that this brief lull under torchlight is a double-edged sword. Respite folded into a deeper darkness. Fear no longer hides behind the sun. It prowls in every shadow, in every flicker of flame. You steady your posture, mentally reviewing survival hacks: dodge, parry, pray, and consider adding nightly prayers to your arsenal. As the brazier's smoke curls toward the rafters, you sense a shift in the crowd's mood. The initial novelty of night's promise has worn off, replaced by anticipation of fresh blood under ancient skies. Torches hiss, embers drift like fireflies, and gladiators step through trapdoors once more. You tighten the grip on your borrowed water skin and exhale, knowing that like every moment here, this faint promise of silence and shadow is fleeting. Darkness in the Colosseum is no friend. It's simply the next act in a ceaseless drama. You trudge forward, muscles quivering like frayed ropes, chased by a phantom rhythm in your limbs. You thought exhaustion might be your undoing hours ago in the midday furnace, but here, in the gathering dusk after that torchlit ceremony, you face a new adversary, delirium masquerading as a phantom second wind. Gladiators, some of Rome's toughest, whispered of a mysterious surge of vitality that struck when you least expected it. A buzzy haze of adrenaline that pushed you beyond mortal limits. Mainstream records note that a handful of famed gladiators fought for over an hour, their names etched into marble as testaments to superhuman stamina. Yet, as you lurch across the sand, you wonder if those feats were glory or delusion. Your legs sting with every step, a fierce reminder of the blistering sun attack and the watery drowning you braved earlier. You recall Section 5's blistering noon and Section 7's honey-poulticed arm, both of which feel like distant memories in this haze. Still, you feel an odd lightness, no heavier than a cloud lifting your chest. It's as if your body conspired to trick you, murmuring, "Push on, champ." Scholars still argue whether this so-called second wind was a real physiological phenomenon triggered by endorphins, or merely the desperate mind latching onto hope. Fringe remedy lore even suggests gladiators chewed willow bark or drank spiced wine to induce this state, though most academics dismiss such claims as battlefield bromides. You pause momentarily by a fallen pillar, pressing a hand to its cool edge, and try to focus. The gloom of night has thickened around the torches, Section 12's flickering flames now mere pinpoints of light. Beneath one stray torch, you catch sight of uneven footprints, a mix of gladiatorial sandals and small animal prints. Section 3 reminded you of the hypogeum rats. Now, you swear tiny paws skitter past your ankles as if spurring you onward. You consider that perhaps your mind is conjuring ghosts of the underworld to goad you past your breaking point. You inhale, tasting burnt honey and vinegar mingled with sweat. Your senses dull at the edges, but your pulse hammers with surprising force. A roar rises from the stands, somewhere between encouragement and bloodlust. You glance up. The crowd is a blur of waving arms, torchlight glinting off bronze helmets and stolas. It's a living tide of faces, alive with expectation. You realize that the arena's true master is not the sword or the sand, but the fervor of the people. Their collective heartbeat pumps a cocktail of fear and excitement into your veins. You wonder if this emotional high is the real second wind, a communal trance pulling fighters from collapse. Historians still argue whether crowds deliberately timed cheers to revive nearly defeated combatants or if it was spontaneous adrenaline fuel. Either way, you feel swept along in the surge. Your breath comes in ragged gasps, each inhale a razor cut, each exhale a plosive sigh. You stumble over a stray gladius, once wielded by a murmillo in Section 11, now discarded and half buried in the sand. You wrap trembling fingers around its hilt for support, noting its weight against your palm. A quick jolt of strength surges through you, as if the sword itself lent you its legendary heft. Fringe whispers claimed some gladiators wore amulets inscribed with Jupiter's name to invoke divine vigor in these moments. But scholars still argue whether religious rites or sheer willpower fueled the feats. You stand upright, mind hazy, and spot a pair of vivid graffiti heart-scarved in Section 11's friendship, passage glowing faintly under the torchlight. They remind you of that odd bond between foes, and you wonder if a shared glance or a silent nod from your ally in the hypogeum could spark a second wind. You lift your head, calling on memories of Section 10's psychological solidarity, thinking that perhaps mental connection matters as much as muscle. You take a shaky step, then another, surprising yourself that your knees obey. The torrent of sensory overload clanging shields, vocal chants, the hiss of torches collides in your ears. You taste iron on your tongue, a callback to Section 6's lion fight. But now it's mixed with sweet honey residue from Section 7's makeshift medicus. You blink, hallucinatory flecks of light drifting like fireflies around your vision. For a wild moment, you imagine yourself weightless, floating above the crowd, an actor in a grand amphitheater of stars. You realize that this surreal lift might be less miracle and more the mind's final act of survival, a last gasp before collapse. Your foot catches a ragged sandal strap, another slip trap left by a faltering gladiator, and you spin, nearly pitching face first into the sand. The blade in your hand clangs against a stone, snapping you back. You clamp your fingers tighter around the gladius, feeling its pulse synchronize with yours. The so-called second wind surges a potent blend of fear, adrenaline, and sheer bloody-mindedness. You're alive, and you're moving. But is moving truly living, or merely postponing the inevitable? A sudden wave of cheers rolls across the arena, spilling over you like heat. You lift your gaze to the Emperor's box, Section 8's ultimate tribunal, imagining his curt nod as a signal that you've earned another breath. The torchlight flickers over his royal features, then dims under a rising breeze. You sense the arena holding its collective breath, waiting to see if you'll stand or fall. You straighten, each muscle a taut wire ready to snap, and step forward into the swirling sand, propelled by the phantom wind in your veins. Your senses narrow to a tunnel of awareness, focused on the next obstacle, a pair of emerging combatants framing the arena gates. Their silhouettes shimmer in the torch, Glarion armed with net and trident, the other clutching a curved dagger. You realize that your second wind might fuel you for one more round, but it won't last past the first exchange. The legend fades as quickly as it arrived, a borrowed spark that can't outshine the coming storm. Still, you forge ahead, heartbeat thrumming in time with your final push. Maybe tomorrow's sun will bring true rest, but for now, you move on, a phantom of endurance dancing in the Colosseum's dying glow. You steady yourself at the threshold of the North Gate, each breath a ragged whisper against the rising clamor of the crowd. This is your final stand, the moment you've weathered 12 sections to reach. Every memory Dawn's mist, Section 1. The clink of sharpened steel, Section 2. The hypogeum's darkness, Section 3. And the lion's rasping roar, Section 6, converges into a single pulse of adrenaline in your veins. Now, as two combatants step through the gate before you, you realize there's no script beyond this point-only raw instinct and the merciless choreography of death. You grip your gladius, the same sturdy sword whose weight lent you courage back in Section 13, and feel its handle slick with sweat. The other fighter stands opposite, a retiarius wielding his weighted net and trident, his silhouette flickering in torchlight that you remember sparked like embers in Section 12. Mainstream records note that combat pairings often featured these mismatched styles to maximize spectacle. Heavy armor against agile nets, brutal shield against darting thrust. Historians still argue whether these pairings were purely for crowd entertainment or designed to test a gladiator's full range of skills. You nod to yourself, thinking this debate matters less when steel meets sinew. The arena floor shudders beneath your sand-caked boots as the crowd surges to its feet-a-living sea of expectation. Somewhere in that roar, you detect echoes of Section 4's first clash, a nostalgic yet jarring callback to the moment you first tasted the crowd's power. You inhale deep, tasting grit and sweat, and feel the burn of every sun-drenched hour. Section 5, still lingering on your skin. Your lungs tighten. This is the crescendo of every trial you've endured. You lunge forward, shield raised. The retiarius retreats with fluid grace, flicking his net in a wide arc that snaps through the air like a whip crack. Sand sprays upward, and you blink through the grain's fringe. Sources claim some nets were anointed with animal fat to confuse a foe's grip, though scholars still argue whether that was widespread or merely rumor. Either way, the net catches the rim of your shield, rattling rivets and sending a jolt through your arm. Pain blooms, a red flare of raw sensation, yet you press on. A whistle pierces the inaudible cue common in Colosseum bouts to regulate pace. The whistle's origin harkens back to Section 4's announcers, those unseen arbiters behind leather-bound scrolls. You recognize it as the signal to engage fully. Your shield muscles groan under the weight, and you parry a trident thrust aimed low. The blade nick scrapes along the outside of your caliga, drawing a thin line of crimson. You taste Ironin, unwelcome yet familiar flavor, since Section 9's Pasca sponges mixed with sweat. You pivot, driving your gladius in a thrust that snaps like lightning. The retiarius sidesteps, trident quivering, and you catch a glimpse of desperation in his eyes, a silent mirror to your own. You recall Section 10's discussion of morbid morale, how fighters sometimes bonded with opponents in fleeting solidarity. In that moment, you hesitate a fraction of a second that feels like an eternity. Scholars still argue whether moments of mercy were genuine or orchestrated by Laniste hungry to spin human drama. You dismiss the question and follow through, embedding the tip of your blade in the sand just inches from his foot. A warning. Not a kill, the retiarius hisses, lunging to entangle your ankle. You recoil, dislodging the net's lead weights, and the crowd gasps a collective intake of breath that vibrates through your bones. You remember Section 8's Emperor's gesture, how 50,000 pairs of eyes once waited on a single thumb. Now, no emperor stands between you and fate. Your own choices decide life or death. You grip the net strand that hangs from his gauntleted wrist and yank with every last ounce of strength, yanking him off balance. He crashes into the sand, flinging grains into the air like golden confetti. For a heartbeat, time freezes. Your gladius hovers an inch from his throat, the flickering torchlight painting his features in harsh relief. You smell smoke-clouded oil from Section 12's torches and the tang of spilled wine dusted by the sands of Section 5. You feel the weight of every lesson learned, every bandaged wound from Section 7, and every second wind caught in Section 13's haze. You realize there's no glory in mercy now. Or perhaps there is, but the crowd demands resolution. The retiarius looks up, eyes wide, panting. His net lies torn and useless beside him, a shredded echo of its former threat. You step forward, heart pounding, and lift your gladius. You hear a faint cough from the stands, perhaps a shopper recalling the day's Posca purchase. Section 9. Perhaps a scholar whispering about the authenticity of gladiatorial friendship. Historians still argue whether a final, ceremonial blow was ever withheld as a ritual courtesy, or if the fallen were immediately dispatched. You decide he's earned yours. You drive your blade forward in a swift arc, aiming for the unprotected flank beneath his ribs. The hilt slides home with a grim whoosh, and you feel the world tilt. The retiarius gasps, twisting before he collapses. Sand erupts around you, bathing your boots in soft granules. You pull free, wiping the blade on his tunic, and the crowd rears back, then erupts in a cacophony that rattles your senses. You stand above the fallen, chest heaving, sweat mingling with dust and the faint remains of honey poultice. You taste victory's bittersweet residue. A modern aside flickers in your mind, someone holding up a winner sign at a karaoke barbet here. No signs are necessary. The crowd's roar is your proclamation. You raise your sword high, shielding your eyes against torchlight and fading daylight, offering your own gesture of triumph. No thumb required. In that echoing moment, you acknowledge every fragment of this day. The oil-slick bodies in Section 2, the subterranean dread of Section 3, the lion snarls in Section 6, the thirst of Section 9, the shadows of Section 12, the phantom wind in Section 13. They have all led you here, to this blood-speckled sand, to this final stand. The victor's anthem surges through you, yet beneath it lies a quiet tremoran undercurrent of regret, of the lives lost and the raw spectacle you've both endured and perpetrated. You sheath your gladius with a metallic click that seems to draw the arena's attention inward, like the quiet end of a thunderstorm. The victor's path is clear, yet the price has been exacted in sinew and sorrow. You take a slow breath, letting the roar wash over you one last time. This is the apex of your Tri-Alpha crucible in which every fear and every fleeting moment of mercy has been tested. As you stand in the heart of the Colosseum, sword still in hand, you realize that warfare has its choreography, a dance of death debated by scholars for centuries. Some claim it was tightly scripted, each motion rehearsed. Others insist it was pure improvisation, life and death balanced on split-second decisions. Historians still argue whether gladiatorial combat was theater or blood sport at its most primal. You smile wryly, knowing that for you, it was both. You lower your gaze to your fallen foe, spare a moment of silent farewell, and step back toward the gate. The roar subsides to murmurs, and torchlight flickers, preparing for the day's final act. You cradle your gladius, weary yet alive, aware that tomorrow and tomorrow are far less certain. The final stand has been made, but the echoes will reverberate long after the sands settle.